Welcome to Season 3 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Josh Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and a former Secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, Stephanie Desmond talks to Alex McCourt, a gun policy researcher at Johns Hopkins, about ghost guns, untraceable guns that come in easy-to-assemble, do-it-yourself kits that are being used in crimes in what appear to be record numbers. Let's listen.
Alex McCourt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So I've been hearing about these things called ghost guns. I know that President Biden wants us to crack down on them. And I'm wondering if you could please tell us all what a ghost gun is.
Sure. So this is a thing that it's pretty new and a lot of people don't really understand it yet. These are just like typical guns, your traditional gun. They function in the same way. They can be just as lethal. They're used in all sorts of crime and violence and even self-harm. The main difference is in how they are manufactured and identified. So these are guns that can be made at home. You can make them at home and with relatively little effort. You can make them from kits that you can order online, have delivered to your house, and they have all of the pieces inside that you need. You can also buy individual pieces and parts and have them all shipped to your house, and you can put them together. And in some cases, you can even 3D print the parts. You can 3D print certain parts and put them together. The big problem with this is that these parts are not by themselves firearms. So they're not guns by themselves. So they don't have to have serial numbers. That's why these are often called ghost guns, is because they don't have serial numbers and they're not traceable when law enforcement recovers them.
So it sounds for a do-it-yourselfer, it sounds a lot like, almost like I bought it at IKEA and put it together. Are they legal?
They are, yeah. So right now, in most states, they are legal. There are a few states that have tried to ban them. One thing that's very difficult about those bans is that because they're not firearms, they flow pretty easily between states. So if your state, let's say you live in New Jersey and your state has banned some of these kits or some of these guns that don't have serial numbers, it's pretty easy to go to, say, Pennsylvania and buy it and bring it back. So those state bans don't always work, and that's why we needed federal action.
So they're not traceable, which obviously is a huge problem. It also sounds to me, since I'm ordering this off the web, that I'm not having a background check. Talk to me about that issue.
Yeah, that's a big issue here too. So these guns do not require a background check. The pieces, you don't have to undergo a background check to buy pieces or the kits. So when you order them online, and in some cases when you buy them at a store, you don't have to undergo a background check. Normally, when you buy a gun, if you buy it from a federally licensed dealer, from a normal kind of gun shop, something that you can physically go to, even like Walmart, if you try to go buy a gun there, you have to undergo a background check. Here, you don't. This is similar to maybe if you just wanted to buy a gun from your friend or a colleague in a state that doesn't have universal background checks. So anybody can buy these pieces. And actually, you're not committing a crime if you are a prohibited possessor. So under federal law and under state law, you might be somebody who is prohibited from having a gun because maybe you are a domestic abuser, or maybe because you have been convicted of a felony in the past and you are barred from having a gun. You are not barred from having these pieces. So you can get the pieces and you're not actually breaking the law until you put them together and have a gun.
So how common are these? I mean, are these becoming more common? Are we seeing more crimes committed with them?
So there are two things that are important to keep in mind. The first is that we don't have really good data on ghost guns. In general, when we're talking about gun violence, we have pretty good data on homicides and crimes that are committed with firearms. But when it comes to firearms themselves, we don't have really good data. A lot of the government trace data where they trace where guns come from is confidential and it's not available to researchers or really to anybody except law enforcement. And this is even more of a problem for these guns because they're not traceable at all. So there's just no good, reliable data that has been collected and published and is available for research. However, law enforcement agencies have been saying that the numbers of these are increasing. So Baltimore City, for example, the police department recently reported a 400% increase in recovery of these guns between 2019 and 2020. Philadelphia saw huge increases between 2019 and 2020. And in March of 2021, said that they had already recovered 80 this year in the city of Philadelphia. And so they're on pace for another record-breaking year of recovery of these. What we don't know and what we'd like to know more about is what kinds of crimes involve ghost guns. Are these being recovered after homicides, robberies, burglaries? Is it gun trafficking operations? We need to know a little bit more about them and also where they're coming from, because even if they can't be traced, they can probably be the origin could be investigated. We can figure out who manufactured the pieces. So anecdotally, we know that use is increasing. There are reports that use is increasing, but we don't have really good data yet.
And I guess that's part of the idea, right? I mean, these are sort of secret guns. No one knows, there's no serial numbers and we can't trace them.
Yeah, that's, I think, a thing that it's really appealing about these guns and these pieces. There have been some fairly high profile incidents. I mean, even just last week, there was a shooting in San Diego where one person died and 4 people were injured, where the shooter reportedly used a ghost gun and was otherwise barred from having guns. So this was basically his one way of acquiring a gun. And this is kind of repeated in other places that people don't have access to guns, but they're able to get these pieces.
That's really scary. So I understand that President Biden has directed the Department of Justice to issue a rule on ghost guns. What does that mean?
So basically, ATF, which is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, is part of the Department of Justice. And they do pretty much everything related to firearms. And one of the things that they do is they determine what falls under federal law, under the federal definition of firearm. And they've determined that certain pieces do and certain pieces don't. So when we're talking about ghost guns, the key piece is the frame or the receiver. And if you picture a gun, maybe a typical handgun, the frame is the piece that all of the other pieces attach to. So it's kind of the shape of a typical handgun, but it's almost hollowed out. It's empty. You need to put everything into it and attach the different pieces so that it will function. If a frame is ready, if it's done and ready to accept all of these pieces, then it's a completed frame. It's 100% complete. And ATF says that is a firearm, even without the other pieces attached. But if it's not quite done, if you need to drill a couple more holes before it can take the other pieces, ATF has said that is not a firearm. And so you don't need to have a serial number and you don't need to undergo a background check. What this rule ideally would do is change that definition so that these unfinished receivers that are included in kits or can be purchased separately would be considered firearms and would have to have a serial number. If they did that, then only licensed manufacturers could sell these kits and pieces. And because they're licensed manufacturers, they would be required to perform background checks on people that they sell them to. ATF can do this kind of outside of legislation. So this is different from Congress passing a law. This is a regulation, kind of a executive agency action that ATF can take. Once they do this, the president gave them, I think, 4 weeks or a month or so to issue a proposed rule. Once they issue the proposed rule, then there will be 90 days of public comment. It will be published in the Federal Register, and anybody can go on and write a comment and tell the ATF, this is a good idea because, this is a bad idea because, or here's how we think it could be changed to be improved. At the end of that 90 days, they'll take all of that into consideration and then either issue a final rule or not. So that's kind of the overall process. And it seems like that's what they're going to do, but the rule hasn't been announced quite yet.
Could this take these guns off the street? Or is the cat out of the bag?
A little bit of both. So I think it will make a difference in terms of how easy it is to get some of these kits, for example. They call them buy, build, shoot kits that are marketed as a really easy way to make a gun at home and ready to go, by the next day, ready to use. I think it'll make it harder to get those. But what this doesn't do is do anything about like 3D printing, which is becoming a much more advanced and complicated technology that's getting easier and easier for people to use at home. And so to a certain extent, those will continue to be prevalent and ghost guns will still exist. But I think this is a really big step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. So if I had the technology, if I had a 3D printer, I could print a frame of my own, right?
You could, yeah. Yeah, you absolutely could. It's a little bit more complicated than just buying the pieces. A lot of people will buy the frame and then 3D print some other pieces to go into it, or they'll 3D print the frame and buy the other pieces to go into it. But yeah, 3D printing, you can absolutely 3D print these parts and use them to make a gun.
Mm-hmm. And if I were somebody who is really intent on getting a firearm, this seems like and I'm not allowed to have a firearm. This seems like an avenue that's open to me.
Yeah, it is. And not only that, it's also an opportunity for people who might be interested in trafficking guns to those people. So if you were part of an organization, an operation where you wanted to manufacture guns and sell them on the criminal market to people who shouldn't have guns, this is a way to do it where those guns cannot be traced back to you.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we're going to see more of different kinds of efforts to create untraceable guns?
I think so. Yeah, I think that especially as technology advances, it's much easier to regulate a kit or an actual physical item than it is to regulate code, when we're talking about 3D printing. I think the best case here is that we have a step in the right direction with this preliminary rule, but also better data. Right? Hopefully, law enforcement agencies at the local, state, federal level will all start collecting and publishing data about the use of these guns so we can really understand how big the problem is and what new interventions or policies we need.
I was going to ask what the solutions are.
Yeah, so I think the proposed rule, from what it sounds, is a really, really important step, especially because it's a blanket federal rule. This isn't kind of a patchwork across states that we have right now. It would be a federal rule that would apply everywhere. And that's a really, really important first step. And I think it will make a difference. In addition, I think people need to be educated about it. I think whether that be violence interrupters, medical professionals, law enforcement, politicians, et cetera, just being aware of it and having conversations about what these guns are and how they're made can be really helpful. But really, to get the best possible solutions, we need more data and we need more evidence.
Alex McCourt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Public Health on Call is produced by Josh Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, C.N. Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo and Neiman Outland. Social media support from Brenda Haggader, Grace Holes Fernandez, and Caroline Wong. Thank you for listening.